They sent a shy bride to the mountain man, but her secret on the first night shattered him until dawn. The first rays of the morning sun struggled to pierce through the thick, gray mist that clung to the village. In the early hours, the world seemed quiet, almost as if it were holding its breath. The small houses, made of rough wood and stone, looked ancient and fragile under the soft, pale light. Birds were just beginning to stir, their faint chirping echoing between the mountains that hugged the village like protective arms. In one of these houses, a young woman sat on a low wooden chair, her fingers tightly clutching a small, worn handkerchief. Her chest rose and fell with nervous breaths, each one trembling slightly, as though the very air she inhaled was heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. She was a shy girl, the kind who rarely raised her voice and often kept her thoughts to herself. The villagers had always described her as quiet, gentle, and cautious. She had grown up under the watchful eyes of her parents, her days filled with simple chores and quiet routines. She liked the stillness of her life, the way the sunlight fell across the wooden floor of her home in the morning, and how the wind carried the faint scent of pine from the mountains nearby. But today, all of that seemed distant. Today, her life was about to change in ways she could not yet imagine. Her parents had insisted on this marriage, saying it was for her own good, as though the careful arrangement would protect her from hardship. But even as she listened to their gentle words and attempts to comfort her, a tight knot of fear had grown in her stomach. She had never met the man she was to marry. He lived far in the mountains, in a cabin that no one visited often, a man known by the villagers as strong, quiet, and unyielding. Stories about him were whispered in corners of the market and near the wells. Some said he was a man of few words, someone who spoke only when necessary. Others claimed he had the strength to fell a tree with his bare hands, and still others whispered that he had never welcomed a stranger into his home. All of these stories weighed on her mind, and yet she had no choice. The elders had decided, her parents had agreed, and she had to follow. She pulled the handkerchief closer to her chest, feeling its worn softness against her fingers. It had belonged to her mother, and she had kept it for years, a quiet reminder of the home and warmth she would leave behind. Now, it was also a shield, something tangible she could hold as she stepped into the unknown. The villagers began to stir outside. Women carried baskets of food, and men prepared their tools for the day. The smell of fresh bread mixed with the cool, damp scent of the mountains. The young woman's father appeared at the doorway, his face lined with age and worry. He did not speak immediately, only watching her with quiet intensity. His eyes, a deep brown, held both pride and sorrow. Finally, he reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "Be brave, my child," he said softly. "The world beyond our village is not as cruel as you fear. Remember, strength does not always mean loudness or power. Sometimes it is quiet courage that carries us through." She nodded, though the tightness in her chest did not loosen. She wanted to believe him, she truly did. But the fear of the unknown was heavy, pressing against her chest like a stone. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I will," she whispered, though her voice trembled, carrying just enough doubt to betray her attempt at bravery. Her mother approached next, a small bundle of folded clothes in her hands. She handed it to her daughter with trembling fingers. "Take these," she said, "and remember, you are never alone even when you feel you are. Trust yourself. Trust your heart." Tears welled up in her mother's eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, hiding them behind the cloth of her apron. The young woman hugged her mother tightly, feeling the warmth of her embrace and the weight of the moment. This hug, she knew, would be the last comfort of home she would feel for a long time. When the time came to leave, she stepped outside, feeling the morning air brush against her skin. It was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, of dew and moss. Every sound seemed sharper, every movement more deliberate. The mountain path that led to her new home looked endless, winding up and away into the clouds. She clutched her bundle of belongings tightly, trying to summon courage with every step. The villagers had gathered near the edge of the path, a mixture of curiosity and sympathy in their eyes. Some whispered prayers for her journey, while others gave her quick, awkward smiles. She tried to meet their eyes, but her gaze kept wandering to the looming mountains ahead. Somewhere beyond those trees and rocks, the man she would marry waited. Somewhere beyond that, her future waited, unknown, unpredictable, and terrifying. As she began to walk, the path beneath her feet was uneven and rocky. Her shoes scraped against the stones, and she stumbled slightly, catching herself on a tree trunk. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the mountain itself resisted her journey. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as though looking back could somehow keep her tethered to the safety of her village. But there was no turning back. The village shrank behind her, the familiar voices fading, replaced by the whispers of the wind through the trees. Hours passed and the path grew steeper. Her legs ached, her heart raced, and yet she pressed on. The sun climbed higher, and the mist that had shrouded the mountains earlier began to thin, revealing the dense forests and rugged cliffs she had only heard about in stories. She could hear the distant sound of a river rushing through the valley, a steady, relentless reminder that life continued even in the most remote corners of the world. Finally, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, she reached the clearing where the mountain cabin stood. It was a simple structure, built from thick logs and stones, with smoke curling lazily from the chimney. It looked both welcoming and formidable, like a fortress that held its secrets close. She paused at the edge of the clearing, taking in the sight. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest. This was the place where her new life would begin. And then she saw him. The man emerged from the cabin, tall and broad-shouldered, his face set in a quiet expression that was hard to read. His eyes were sharp, dark, and seemed to look straight into her very being. There was a strength in his stance, a presence that made the air feel heavier around him. She felt a shiver run down her spine, not from the cold but from the sheer intensity of the moment. He did not speak at first. He simply watched her, his gaze steady and unyielding. She lowered her eyes, feeling suddenly small and fragile under the weight of his scrutiny. She had heard the stories, yes, but seeing him in person was different. He was not just a man of strength. He was a man who seemed to carry the mountain itself on his shoulders, silent and unshakable. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of earth and pine. The sun cast long shadows across the clearing, and the quiet of the mountains seemed to press in on her from all sides. She wanted to say something to break the silence, but her voice felt trapped inside her throat. All she could do was stand there, clutching her small bundle, waiting for him to make the first move. Finally, he nodded toward the cabin. "Come inside," he said, his voice low and calm, but carrying a weight that made her heart skip a beat. She nodded, her hands trembling slightly, and took the first step toward the cabin. Each step felt monumental, as if she were crossing into another world, a world of unknown challenges, of secrets yet to be revealed, of a life that would demand more courage than she had ever known. As she stepped through the doorway, the warmth of the fire inside wrapped around her like a strange, comforting embrace. She glanced at him, standing near the hearth, and wondered what this first night would bring. Would he be kind? Would he be gentle? Or would the shadows of the stories she had heard come to life in the way he looked at her? She did not know. All she knew was that there was no turning back. Her future began here, in this small cabin in the mountains, with a man she had never met and a life she could not yet imagine. Her hands tightened around the handkerchief again, drawing strength from its familiar softness. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped fully inside, ready to face whatever awaited her. The door closed behind her with a soft thud, and the quiet of the mountains seemed to hold its breath once more. The cabin smelled of burning wood and pine, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The walls were made of thick logs, rough and sturdy, and a small window let in the fading light of the late afternoon. The young woman stepped fully inside, her hand still clutching her small bundle of belongings. Every sound felt amplified in the quiet cabin, the creak of the wooden floor beneath her feet, the whisper of the wind through the slightly open window, and the soft crackle of the fire. The mountain man stood near the hearth, his silhouette tall and strong against the glow of the flames. He did not move immediately, only watching her with dark, steady eyes. There was something unreadable about him, a calmness that seemed almost unnatural, as though he were always in control, always aware. The young woman swallowed hard, feeling her throat dry, her lips pressed together to keep her voice steady. She had imagined this moment for hours on the journey up the mountain, but seeing him in person was far more intimidating than she had anticipated. Finally, he spoke, his voice deep and low, carrying a weight that made her chest tighten. "Sit," he said, nodding toward a rough wooden chair near the fire. She obeyed without a word, careful not to stumble on the uneven floor. As she lowered herself into the chair, her eyes flicked around the cabin. It was simple but practical. A small table stood in the center with a few neatly stacked bowls. A pot hung over the fire, and blankets were folded carefully on a wooden bench. Everything seemed arranged with precision, yet there was a warmth in the space, a quiet liveliness despite the rugged simplicity. The mountain man moved to a small shelf, selecting a clean mug and filling it with water from a clay jug. He handed it to her without a word. She took it with both hands, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He nodded slightly in acknowledgement and returned to the fire, his movements deliberate, almost careful, as though he was measuring each step. She studied him quietly, taking in his strong shoulders, the way his hands moved with both power and precision, and the sharpness in his eyes. There was something intense about him, but also a quiet curiosity, a subtle awareness that went beyond his strong exterior. He was not a man who wasted words or gestures. Every movement seemed purposeful, measured, deliberate. It made her heart race in a strange way, half fear, half fascination. For a long time, neither spoke. The fire crackled, the shadows danced across the walls, and the silence stretched. She wanted to ask questions, to learn more about the man she would now call her husband, but the weight of the moment held her tongue. Finally, she found herself whispering almost to herself, "It's so different here, so quiet." The mountain man's eyes flicked toward her just for a moment, and she thought she saw a faint expression, something almost like a smile, though it was subtle and quickly gone. He did not speak, but his presence felt less imposing, as though he were observing her, studying her reactions carefully. She felt both relieved and even more nervous, unsure how to read him. Minutes passed, filled only with the small sounds of the cabin, the soft hiss of the fire, the wind outside, and the gentle tapping of her own heartbeat. She glanced at her bundle, now resting on the floor beside her feet. Her fingers itched to unpack it, to organize her few belongings, but she felt awkward doing anything that might seem forward. She was a stranger in his home, a guest in a place that was his sanctuary. Every step she took felt like walking on invisible ground, unsure of where she might stumble. The mountain man finally spoke again, his voice calm but carrying a tone of quiet authority. "You must be tired from your journey." She nodded, unsure if she should speak, her throat tight with nerves. "Yes," she said softly. "It was long. The path was steep." Her words came haltingly, but he seemed to understand, only nodding in acknowledgement. He didn't press her, didn't force conversation. Instead, he turned his attention back to the fire, throwing another log onto it with a precise flick of his wrist. The flames leapt higher, casting a golden glow across the room. She shifted in her chair, trying to find a comfortable position. Her legs ached from the long walk, and her shoulders were tense from carrying her bundle. She noticed that despite his imposing presence, he seemed calm, almost relaxed, and she wondered if he was always this way. There was a quiet confidence in him that she could not ignore, a steady calm that made her feel both anxious and oddly safe at the same time. As she watched him, she realized that he was not just a man of strength, but of thought. Every motion was deliberate, and he seemed aware of every sound, every movement in the cabin. She felt like an intruder at first, but slowly she began to notice something else, a certain gentleness in the way he handled objects, a carefulness that did not match the stories of the fierce mountain man she had heard in the village. It puzzled her and stirred her curiosity. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the lines of a life lived in the mountains. There was hardness there, yes, but also depth, as though his silence was a shield that protected something more vulnerable inside. She could not imagine what his life had been like, alone in the mountains, far from the village and its people. She wondered what had shaped him into the man standing before her, a man who could be so strong and yet so quiet, so imposing and yet so precise in his actions. A sudden breeze drifted through the slightly open window, carrying the scent of pine and cold mountain air. She shivered and pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders. The mountain man noticed and tossed a blanket toward her, which she caught awkwardly. "Thank you," she whispered again, and he only nodded. His silence was not unkind. It was measured, as though he was choosing his words carefully, weighing their meaning before speaking. She took a deep breath, summoning courage she did not feel. "Do you live here all alone?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. His eyes met hers for the first time with directness, and she felt a flicker of tension. There was no judgment in his gaze, only observation. He considered her question for a long moment before answering. "Most of the time," he said simply. His words were short, but they carried weight, a quiet honesty that made her realize this man did not lie, even in small things. She nodded, unsure what else to say. Silence fell again, but it was different this time. It felt like the silence of two people trying to understand each other, two strangers navigating a delicate space between fear and curiosity. She felt the tension in her chest ease just a little, replaced by cautious interest. Maybe, she thought, he was not as unapproachable as the stories suggested. Dinner arrived, a simple meal of bread, cheese, and stew, prepared with care and left on a small wooden table. She noticed the effort he had made, how everything was neat and orderly. Her hands shook slightly as she took her first bite, feeling both nervous and grateful. He ate quietly, eyes forward, occasionally glancing at her. She felt watched, but not in a threatening way. It was as if he were trying to understand her, to read her mind without speaking. The hours passed slowly, filled with small gestures and unspoken communication. She found herself observing him more closely. The way he chewed thoughtfully, the careful movements of his hands, the way his eyes softened slightly when he thought she was not looking. She realized that despite his stoic exterior, there was more to him than the villagers' tales had ever suggested. She began to feel a tentative sense of curiosity, and even a small spark of comfort, knowing she was not entirely alone in this new world. As night fell, the cabin grew quiet except for the crackling fire. The young woman gathered her courage once more, realizing that the first night with him would be a test, not of her strength, but of the bond that might begin between them. She wanted to speak, to learn more about the man she would live with, but words failed her. Instead, she simply watched him, the flickering light painting his features in warm gold and deep shadow. The mountain man finally broke the silence. "Rest now," he said softly, his voice gentle but firm. She nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and nervous anticipation. He showed her the small room prepared for her, simple but clean, with a warm bed and soft blankets. She looked at him, uncertainty in her eyes. Will it be all right?" she asked quietly. He studied her for a moment, and she thought she saw a flicker of something, concern perhaps, or curiosity. Then he nodded. "It will be," he said simply. and with that he left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Alone in the dim light of the room, she allowed herself to breathe fully for the first time in hours. She lay on the bed, thinking about the man she had just met, wondering about the life ahead. The first encounter had been strange, tense, and filled with uncertainty, but there had also been something else, something subtle, like a promise of understanding waiting to grow. Outside, the wind whispered through the mountains, carrying the quiet of the night with it. Inside, the fire crackled one last time before fading to embers. The young woman closed her eyes, holding her handkerchief tightly. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, she felt the faintest spark of hope. The night in the cabin was quiet, broken only by the occasional pop from the dying fire. Shadows danced across the walls, flickering like whispers of unknown stories. The young woman sat on the edge of her bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, feeling a nervous flutter in her chest. Her mind raced, thinking about the journey she had taken, the path that had led her here, and the man she now shared this small space with. She could hear the soft sound of his movements outside the room. The mountain man, ever careful, was tending to the fire one last time before resting. His presence, even in another part of the cabin, filled the space with a quiet weight. It made her heart beat faster, not with fear this time, but with a complicated mixture of curiosity, anxiety, and something she could not yet name. She had carried her secret with her for years, and now, the moment had come where she felt she could no longer hold it inside. For hours she had rehearsed the words in her mind. How could she tell him? How could she reveal something so personal, something she had hidden from everyone, even her own family? She knew the moment she spoke, everything could change. Everything she had known about herself, about him, about this new life. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the small handkerchief her mother had given her, the familiar softness grounding her in the midst of her fear. Finally, summoning every ounce of courage she could muster, she rose from the bed and stepped quietly toward the hearth. The firelight flickered across the floor, illuminating the mountain man's strong silhouette as he sat on a log near the embers. He glanced up as she approached, his dark eyes meeting hers with a mixture of curiosity and calm observation. I need to tell you something," she began, her voice shaking slightly. She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the handkerchief. "Something I have never told anyone." She paused, the words catching in her throat. His eyes softened and he nodded, silently encouraging her to continue. She swallowed hard and spoke again, this time with more determination. I have a past, one that I cannot change. There are things I have done, things that have happened to me that make me different from others. She hesitated, feeling a lump rise in her throat. Her eyes flicked to the fire as though it might somehow lend her courage. I am not perfect. The mountain man remained silent, his expression unreadable. The way he looked at her made her heart race even faster. She had expected anger, disappointment, maybe even rejection. But his calm gaze unnerved her even more because it gave nothing away. It was as if he were listening not just to her words, but to the fear and vulnerability behind them. Taking another deep breath, she forced herself to continue. I lost someone I loved very much," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was my fault, or at least I feel it was, and since then I have carried this pain with me. I have tried to hide it to move on, but Her voice broke and she turned away, struggling to maintain her composure. "I am afraid it will hurt you or make you see me differently." For a long moment there was only silence. The crackling of the fire seemed impossibly loud in the quiet cabin. She felt exposed, as though she had laid bare her entire soul, and the vulnerability made her chest ache. She had imagined his reaction in countless ways, each more terrifying than the last, but nothing could have prepared her for the uncertainty of the present. Then, slowly, he stood. His tall figure moved toward her, and she could feel the warmth radiating from him as he stopped just a few feet away. She dared not look at him directly, afraid of what she might see in his eyes. But he spoke softly, his deep voice steady and calm. "You do not have to be perfect," he said. "No one is, and the past, the things we cannot change, they do not define who we are now." She blinked, shocked at the gentleness in his words. She had expected judgment, anger, or at least some sign of disappointment. Instead, he seemed understanding. But there was also a flicker of something else in his eyes, a pain, a shadow, something that made her realize he, too, had known suffering. I didn't know how to tell anyone," she admitted, her voice quivering. "I thought maybe it was better to keep it hidden, to pretend it never happened, but now I cannot pretend anymore." He nodded slowly, as though he understood far more than she had said. "It is not easy to reveal such truths," he said, "and yet here you are. That takes courage. More than many can ever know." His words, though simple, made her chest tighten with emotion. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, she felt a small flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she had found someone who could see her, truly see her, and not turn away. She finally lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes. In the firelight, she could see the depth in them, the strength, yes, but also a quiet vulnerability. Are you not angry?" she asked hesitantly, the fear of rejection still clinging to her heart. His gaze softened further and he stepped closer, his presence calm yet powerful. "Anger does not help anyone," he said. "What you carry, it is heavy, but it is yours, not mine. I cannot take it from you, nor would I want to. What I can do is see you as you are and decide if we can move forward together." Her heart raced, a mixture of relief and nervous anticipation flooding her chest. She had expected so many things, and yet this calm, measured understanding was something entirely new. She realized that the stories she had heard about him, the tales of the fierce mountain man, were only part of the truth. There was a depth, a complexity to him that no story could capture. She took a small step toward him, her hand trembling slightly. I am afraid," she admitted, "afraid that this secret will change everything." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers but not touching. "It does not have to," he said. "The truth, once shared, can either break us or bring us closer. That depends not on what happened, but on what we choose to do now." For a long moment, they simply stood there, the firelight casting long shadows across the walls. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down, heavy yet strangely comforting. The mountain man's presence was commanding, yet it did not intimidate her now. Instead, it grounded her, made her feel seen and acknowledged in a way she had never experienced before. Finally, she found the courage to speak again. Will you still stay with me?" she asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. He studied her for a moment, and then slowly a small, genuine smile touched his lips. "Yes," he said simply, "I will stay, tonight, tomorrow, for as long as it takes. We will face what comes together." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she felt a mix of relief, gratitude, and an unexpected sense of hope. For the first time in a long while, she felt that perhaps her past, her pain, her secret, could coexist with her future. She was not alone in this anymore. The mountain man gestured toward the fire. "Sit with me," he said softly. Hesitant but willing, she joined him near the embers, feeling the warmth of the fire, the quiet strength of his presence, and the fragile, budding trust between them. They did not speak much after that, but the silence was different now. It was not filled with tension or fear. Instead, it was a quiet understanding, a shared acknowledgement of vulnerability and courage. The night stretched on, and the stars outside the small window twinkled like distant promises. She watched him, realizing that the man she had feared and admired from afar was not a figure of judgment or cruelty, but a person shaped by his own experiences, his own trials, much like herself. In this shared space, in the quiet of the cabin, they had begun to understand each other, not through words alone, but through honesty and trust. Hours passed, and the fire dwindled to glowing embers. They finally prepared to rest, each aware of the fragile bond that had begun to form between them. As she lay on her bed, she felt a small, steady warmth in her chest, a sense that, despite the secrets, the fears, and the unknown future, she was beginning to find a place where she belonged. Outside, the wind whispered through the mountains, carrying the calm of the night. Inside, the young woman and the mountain man rested in the quiet, the first night marked not by fear or judgment, but by understanding, courage, and the quiet hope of a bond that had just begun to grow. The cabin was quiet again, the fire reduced to glowing embers that cast long, soft shadows across the wooden walls. The young woman lay on her bed, her fingers tracing the folds of her blanket as her mind replayed the night's events. Her secret had been shared, and the weight of it seemed lighter now, though it still pressed gently on her heart. She could hear the mountain man moving quietly outside her room, pacing slowly near the hearth. The sound of his footsteps, heavy yet measured, seemed to echo the turmoil inside him. She had never seen him like this before. Until tonight, he had always been calm, composed, unyielding in his demeanor. But now there was a tension in the way he moved, a flicker of something raw and unfiltered in his posture. She realized that he, too, carried burdens, secrets, and emotions that had never been spoken aloud. The realization made her heart ache for him, even as her own fear of the unknown lingered. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, she rose and quietly approached the fire. The warmth of the embers brushed against her face as she saw him standing there, his back to her, hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He did not notice her at first, lost in thought, a storm of emotions swirling behind his calm exterior. I don't want to disturb you," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. He turned slowly, his dark eyes meeting hers. For the first time, she saw the full weight of his emotions reflected there: anger, fear, sadness, and a deep, unspoken longing. He ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tight, as though he were struggling to contain the torrent of thoughts and feelings that had been stirred by her confession. "You did not disturb me," he said quietly, though there was a sharp edge to his tone. I have not dealt with this," he admitted, gesturing vaguely, "in a long time." She took a hesitant step closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I never meant to bring anything painful to you. I only wanted to be honest." His gaze softened slightly, though the tension in his shoulders remained. "Honesty is not easy," he said, his voice low, almost a growl at times. "It cuts deeper than lies sometimes because it demands that we face truths we would rather hide." He paused, staring into the fading embers. "You have shown me a truth I did not expect, and now it is heavy in my mind." She nodded, understanding in a way words could not fully express. She knew he was struggling, and she felt a strange connection to his pain. "I know it is difficult," she whispered, "and I do not expect you to understand everything immediately. I only hope that we can face it together." He let out a deep breath, almost as if he were letting go of some invisible weight. "Together," he repeated, the word carrying both a promise and a question. He took a step closer, and she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I have lived in these mountains alone for many years. I thought I had built walls around myself, walls that nothing could breach. And yet, your words have shaken them in ways I cannot explain." She watched him carefully, noting the subtle tremor in his hands, the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes flickered with unspoken emotions. He was strong, yes, but beneath that strength was a vulnerability she had never imagined. She realized then that he too was human, capable of fear, doubt, and pain. And that realization made her feel closer to him, even in this moment of uncertainty. I am not afraid of your past," he said suddenly, his voice firmer now. "I do not know all the details, and I do not need to. What matters is that you are here, that you have been honest, and that you trust me enough to share it." Her chest tightened with emotion. She had expected rejection, disappointment, perhaps even anger. But instead he spoke with a quiet strength, a willingness to face the truth alongside her. It made her heart ache with gratitude and a tentative hope. I do trust you," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "Even though I am scared, I want to try, with you." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable for a moment before softening into something she could not quite name, relief, perhaps, or a fragile acceptance. "Then we try," he said simply. "Not for the past, not for the expectations of others, but for this moment, for what we can build together." They sat down near the fire, the embers glowing faintly between them. For a long time neither spoke. The young woman watched him, noticing the way his strong hands rested on his knees, the way his eyes, though dark and intense, held a softness when he looked at her. She felt a strange calm settle over her, a quiet understanding that they were both navigating unfamiliar territory, learning to face emotions that had long been buried. Finally, she found the courage to ask a question that had been lingering in her mind. Do you ever regret living alone?" she asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her for a long moment, considering his answer. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but it is not regret that I feel. It is a longing, a wish that someone could understand the man I am, the life I have led. And yet, I have learned to survive, to endure. The mountains are my home, but they are also my cage in a way." She reached out tentatively, placing a hand near his, though not touching yet. "Then maybe, tonight, we can begin to understand each other," she said softly. "Not for the past, not for the stories, but for us." He looked at her hand, then back at her face, and for a moment the quiet strength he always carried seemed to waver. Slowly he reached out, letting his hand hover over hers, the warmth from his skin radiating comfort. "Yes," he said, his voice low and steady. "We will begin." The fire crackled softly, casting a golden glow over them. The young woman felt a mixture of relief and nervous anticipation. This was the first time they had truly spoken, truly shared their thoughts and emotions without fear of judgment. She realized that the night was no longer filled with tension or fear. It was filled with possibility, with the fragile beginnings of trust and understanding. Hours passed, but time seemed to move differently in the quiet cabin. They talked softly, sharing fragments of their pasts, their fears and their hopes. The mountain man spoke of the loneliness he had felt in the mountains, the challenges of surviving in a harsh, isolated environment, and the strength he had learned to cultivate over the years. She listened attentively, feeling a growing sense of connection, empathy, and admiration. In turn, she shared small pieces of her life, the routines of her village, the quiet moments she had cherished, and the simple joys she had taken for granted. She did not reveal everything, not yet, but enough to allow him to see the woman behind the shy exterior, the heart that had carried pain yet remained resilient. As the night wore on, the fire dwindled to glowing embers, and the cabin grew colder. He moved to add another log to the fire, the flames leaping higher and casting their shadows across the walls. She watched him, noticing the care and precision in his movements, the way he seemed to balance strength with gentleness. It was a revelation to her, the depth of his character, the quiet power that came not from dominance, but from resilience, patience, and an unwillingness to give in to fear. Finally, he returned to sit near her, the quiet settling over them once more. Neither spoke for a long time, and yet the silence was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was a shared silence, a moment of mutual understanding, trust, and quiet companionship. She felt a warmth in her chest, a sense that despite the challenges, the fear, and the unknown future, they had begun to build a foundation, one that could support the fragile beginnings of a bond between them. "You are different from what I imagined," he said finally, his voice soft but carrying weight. "I expected fear, weakness, hesitation, but I see courage, honesty, and a willingness to face the unknown. That surprises me." She smiled faintly, a mixture of relief and gratitude. "And you are not what I imagined either," she said softly. "I thought you would be harsh, distant, impossible to reach. But you listen, and you feel. That gives me hope." He nodded slowly, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. "Then perhaps hope is exactly what we need," he said. "Not certainty, not perfection, but hope and the courage to face what comes together." The young woman felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she quickly brushed it away. It was not sadness, but a release, a quiet acknowledgement of the pain she had carried, the fear she had faced, and the fragile possibility of something new, something real. Outside, the wind whispered through the mountains, carrying the quiet of the night with it. Inside, the young woman and the mountain man sat near the fire, their hearts and minds slowly opening to one another. It was not a perfect moment, and the future was still uncertain. But for the first time they had spoken honestly, faced their fears, and found a fragile connection that might, in time, grow into something stronger, something lasting, something worth holding on to. The night stretched on, the embers glowing faintly, and the quiet of the cabin seemed almost sacred. In this shared space, they had begun to understand each other, not through grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but through honesty, patience, and the courage to face the weight of their emotions together. And as the first hints of dawn began to light the edges of the small window, there was a sense that, despite everything, they were no longer alone. The first light of dawn began to filter softly through the small window of the cabin. It painted the walls in pale gold and pink, casting long, delicate shadows that danced slowly across the floor. Outside, the mountain stood tall and silent, bathed in the gentle glow of early morning. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying the faint scent of pine, damp earth, and the coolness of the night that was slowly giving way to the warmth of a new day. Inside, the cabin was quiet, except for the faint crackle of the last embers of the fire. The young woman stirred, blinking against the soft light as she sat up on the edge of her bed. The night had been long, filled with honest words, shared fears, and the tentative building of trust between her and the mountain man. For the first time, she felt a strange, gentle warmth in her chest, a sense of hope that had not existed before. The mountain man was already awake, though he had not moved much from his place near the fire. His eyes, dark and steady, followed her as she stretched and gathered her thoughts. The quiet of the morning was different from the silence of the night. It was calm, reassuring, and full of possibilities. She felt a mixture of nervous anticipation and a quiet relief. The first night together had been challenging, yes, but it had also been transformative. She realized that the man before her, once intimidating and distant, was now someone she could begin to understand, and perhaps even trust. She rose and moved toward the fire, letting the soft warmth brush against her skin. He looked at her, his gaze calm yet intense, as though he were seeing her truly for the first time, not just the shy, quiet girl the village had described, but the person she had revealed through her words and actions. She felt a flicker of courage and spoke softly. "Good morning," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Good morning," he replied. His voice was low, steady, carrying the same calm strength that had both unsettled and intrigued her the night before. He gestured toward the small table where a simple breakfast had been prepared, fresh bread, cheese, and a pot of warm tea. "Eat," he said. "It will give you strength for the day ahead." She hesitated for a moment, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. Then she nodded and moved to sit at the table. The firelight warmed the cabin, and she felt a sense of comfort in the simple act of sharing a meal. They ate quietly, the silence this time not heavy with tension, but filled with the subtle, growing understanding between them. As she sipped her tea, she noticed the careful way he handled each movement, the precision in his hands, the thoughtfulness in his gestures, and the quiet patience in his demeanor. She realized that this man, so often described as harsh and unapproachable, had a depth she had never imagined. He carried strength, yes, but it was tempered with thoughtfulness, empathy, and a quiet resilience. The realization made her heart beat a little faster, not with fear, but with admiration and something else she was only beginning to understand. After a moment she spoke, her voice soft but determined. I want to thank you," she said, "for last night. For listening, for not judging, for being here." He looked at her, his eyes meeting hers, and the faint smile returned. "You shared something difficult," he said. "Courage is not always loud or visible, but it is still courage. You have it, and that is something I respect." His words were simple, yet they carried weight, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time since leaving her village, she felt truly seen, understood, and accepted. They finished breakfast in quiet companionship, the sound of the mountains outside a gentle reminder that the world continued beyond the small cabin. She felt a sense of peace in this shared moment, a fragile, delicate sense that perhaps this life, this unexpected journey, could be one she could embrace. After the meal, he moved to tend to the fire, adding another log to keep the embers warm. She watched him, noticing the strength in his movements, the care in his actions, and the quiet thoughtfulness that defined him. She realized that the stories she had heard in the village, the whispers of fear and awe, were only part of the truth. There was more to him, depth, patience, and a quiet understanding that could not be seen from the outside. Finally, he turned toward her, his eyes steady and calm. "You are awake," he said simply. "Yes," she replied, a faint smile touching her lips. "And I feel better. Safer somehow." His gaze softened and he nodded slowly. "Good, that is important. Safety is not only the absence of danger but the presence of trust, and I want you to feel that here." Her heart lifted at his words, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not of sadness, but of relief and gratitude. For the first time in a long while, she felt the possibility of a new beginning, a life shaped not by fear, tradition, or the expectations of others, but by honesty, understanding, and mutual respect. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. Will you teach me about your life here? The mountains, the cabin, the work?" He raised an eyebrow, a faint amusement in his expression. "Are you ready for hard work?" he asked, though there was no teasing in his tone, only curiosity. She nodded, determination replacing her earlier nervousness. "I want to learn. I want to be a part of this life with you." For a moment he studied her, the intensity in his dark eyes unwavering. Then slowly he smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Very well," he said. "Then we begin, not with fear or expectation but with learning together." They spent the morning preparing the cabin and the surrounding area. She helped fetch water from the nearby stream, swept the floor, and arranged the small household items with his guidance. He showed her how to tend to the fire, check the supplies, and maintain the simple routines that kept the cabin running smoothly. She watched him closely, noticing the quiet care in every instruction, the patience with which he corrected her mistakes, and the subtle pride that shone through when she did something correctly. As the hours passed, she felt herself growing more confident, more comfortable in this new life. The fear that had gripped her since leaving the village began to fade, replaced by a tentative sense of belonging. She realized that the man she had once feared was now a teacher, a companion, and someone she could begin to trust completely. By midday, they paused to rest near the stream, the water sparkling in the sunlight and the mountains standing tall around them. She watched him carefully, noticing the way his eyes softened as he looked at the flowing water, the gentle way he handled the rocks and branches around them. She felt a quiet admiration for him, a growing understanding that strength could be measured not only in power, but in patience, resilience, and the willingness to care for others. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. I am grateful," she said. "For last night, for today, for everything. I did not expect any of this. but now I feel like I have found a place where I belong." He looked at her, his gaze unwavering, and for a moment there was a quiet intensity that made her heart beat faster. "You do belong here," he said. "Not because of duty or expectation, but because you choose to be here, and because you are willing to face life as it comes. That is courage, and that earns respect." She smiled faintly, feeling a tear slip down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. The day passed slowly, each moment building a deeper sense of connection and understanding. They worked together, laughed quietly at small mistakes, and shared stories of their lives. The mountain man revealed small fragments of his past, the hardships he had endured, the solitude he had lived with, and the quiet joys he had discovered in the simplicity of the mountains. She in turn shared her own memories, the moments of happiness she had cherished in the village, and the small dreams she still held for the future. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, they returned to the cabin. The young woman felt a sense of peace she had never known, a quiet understanding that despite the challenges, despite the fears and uncertainties, they had begun to build something real. She realized that trust, patience, and honesty had created a bond between them, a bond that could, in time, grow into something stronger, something lasting. That evening, as they sat together near the fire, the young woman felt a deep sense of gratitude and hope. She had arrived at the cabin full of fear and uncertainty, carrying a secret that had weighed heavily on her heart. Yet now, she felt lighter, braver, and understood in a way she had never imagined. The mountain man, once a figure of intimidation and mystery, had become a companion, a guide, and someone she could begin to trust fully. Outside, the mountains stood silent, their peaks glowing softly in the fading light. Inside, the cabin was warm, filled with the quiet comfort of shared understanding, the fragile beginnings of trust, and the possibility of a new life together. For the first time since leaving her village, the young woman felt that she was exactly where she belonged. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, she sat quietly near the fire, her hand brushing against the mountain man's, a small but deliberate gesture of connection. He met her gaze, and in that silent exchange, they both understood that the journey ahead would not be easy, but it would be shared. Together. The cabin, the mountains, and the quiet night seemed to hold their breath, witnessing the fragile promise of trust, hope, and a bond that had begun to take root in the most unexpected of places. And as the young woman finally closed her eyes, resting near the warmth of the fire and the presence of the man she was beginning to know, she felt the first true sense of belonging in her life, a sense that, despite everything, the dawn had arrived, bringing with it new beginnings.